She's the nanny. She watches the little one for us.
My brother-in-law said that in a hallway at the Pentagon, with his hand on my shoulder like he was steadying a chair, and the woman he said it to smiled at me the way you smile at someone who will not be at the table.
I said nothing.
My granddaughter had my other hand. She was 7 years old, and she was counting the flags on the wall. 31 years before that morning, a set of orders had been signed, with my name on them. That afternoon, a general officer was going to say those orders out loud into a microphone in front of 300 people, and my brother-in-law was going to hear 30 years of his own voice come back at him. To understand how a family gets a story that wrong, and then keeps it, polishes it, hands it down at Thanksgiving like a serving dish, I have to go back. Back to a small kitchen in Arlington, Virginia, and a plain government envelope I almost threw away with the grocery flyers. My name is Vivian Strand. I was 60 years old that spring. I spent 28 years in the United States Army, and for the last 9 of them, I have not talked about a single day of it.
Not because it was secret. Most of it wasn't, because nobody ever asked twice.
Let me tell you about the house first, because the house is where all of this actually happened. The Pentagon was just where it got said out loud. It's a 1-story brick place off a street with too many stop signs, with a yard the size of a good rug and a maple that drops enough leaves every October to bury a car. Ray and I bought it the year I put in my retirement papers. He picked it because of the yard. I picked it because of the kitchen window which faces east, and because after all those years of waking up in places where the light came in wrong, I wanted a window that would tell me the truth about the time of day.
Ray died 4 years ago.
Heart. He was sitting in the green chair with the crossword in his lap, and the pen still capped, and the coffee on the side table was still warm when I found him. And I have thought about that warm cup more than I have thought about almost anything else in my life.
He was Army too.
Infantry, then a long, slow slide into a supply room after his knees quit, then 20 years selling hardware at a store on Glebe Road. He was a good man, with a loud laugh and one enormous blind spot, which I will get to. 2 years after Ray, my son Daniel's marriage came apart. Not with a bang, with a long grinding sound like a truck downshifting on a hill for 6 miles. And when the dust settled, Daniel had a job that put him on the road 11 days out of 14, and his daughter Rosie had a bedroom in my house with glow stars on the ceiling, that I put up myself, standing on a kitchen chair at 11 at night, because a 7-year-old had asked, and I did not want her to have to ask twice. Rosie is small for her age, and serious in a way that catches people off guard. She counts things: flags, stairs, ceiling tiles, the seconds between the porch light flicker and the buzz it makes. She takes her shoes off at the door and lines them up square with the wall, and I have never once told her to do that. There is a folded flag in a triangle case in my hall closet on the shelf above the winter coats, and it is Ray's. There is also a garment bag hanging behind the coats, zipped, that I had not opened in 4 years. Rosie asked about the bag once. I told her it was an old work uniform. She said, "What kind of work?" And I said, "It was a long time ago." That sentence is going to come up again. I want you to remember it because for about 30 years it was the only answer I ever gave anybody, and I believed it was a kind of modesty. It took a Pentagon hallway and a 7-year-old to show me it was something else. Here is what my family believed about me, and had believed since the Reagan administration. They believed I did paperwork in a warehouse. They believed it because my brother-in-law, Curtis Vale, said it first, and said it well, and said it often. Curtis is Ray's older brother. He was 66 that spring. He sells commercial real estate in Fairfax County, and he is very good at it. And the thing that makes him good at it is the same thing that made him impossible at a dinner table. Curtis fills silence. It is a physical need with him. If there is a gap in a conversation, Curtis will pour himself into it, and whatever he says in that gap becomes the official version, because everybody else is just relieved somebody said something. The first time he did it to me was at a cookout in 1989. I was a young captain. Somebody asked what I did, and I said I was in transportation. And before I could get to the second sentence, Curtis said, "She counts boots. Ray's the one who was out there. Viv keeps the clipboard."
Everybody laughed. Ray laughed. That's the blind spot I mentioned. Ray never corrected his brother. Not once in 34 years. I asked him about it exactly one time in the car on the way home from a wedding, and he went quiet for 4 miles and then said, "Curtis needs to be the one who knows things, Viv. It doesn't cost us anything." But it did cost something. It just billed us slowly. So the story hardened. Ray was the soldier. I was the clipboard. At every graduation and every funeral and every 4th of July, Curtis would introduce me to somebody new and say some version of the same line, and I would stand there with a paper plate in my hand and let it go by, because correcting him would have meant a scene, and a scene at my mother-in-law's table was a thing I had decided a long time ago I was not going to spend my life having. And there was another reason, and it is less noble, so I'll say it plainly. Some part of me thought that if they had wanted to know, they would have asked. That silence was a test. I was letting them fail quietly, year after year, and keeping score in a ledger nobody knew existed but me. That is not modesty. I know that now. The invitation came in the middle of March. It came to Curtis first, which is the detail that mattered. Somebody in the family had put his address on something 20 years ago, and it had never been changed. And so a heavy cream envelope with a Department of the Army return address landed in a mailbox in Fairfax instead of mine, and Curtis opened it, and Curtis drew the only conclusion Curtis was ever going to draw. He called me at 9 on a Tuesday night. I remember because Rosie had just gone down and I was standing at the sink with the water off, doing that thing where you look at your own reflection in a dark window and can't quite decide who you're looking at. "Viv," he said. "Big news. There's a thing at the Pentagon next month. Recognition ceremony. Families invited." I said, "A thing. A ceremony, Viv. Big one. And listen, I think I know how this happened. You remember Hal Pruitt from the Chamber? His son-in-law is somebody over there now, and I've been talking to Hal about a property on Eade Street for 8 months. 8 months! I'm not saying that's it. I'm saying doors open when you keep knocking." I did not say anything. Curtis filled the gap. Of course he did. "Anyway, whole family's going. Marlene, the kids, Daniel, if he can get off the road. And you should come. Bring the little one. She'll love the flags." She'll love the flags. He wasn't wrong about that. I said I'd think about it. He said something about parking. And then Marlene got on the line, the way she always does at the end of a call, like a customs check on the way out. Marlene is 63 and kind in the specific way that is worse than unkind. She never says a cruel thing. She just asks questions that have the cruelty pre-installed. She said, "Vivian, honey, do you have anything to wear to something like that? Because I'm going Saturday and I could pick you up something nice. Nothing fancy, just something that won't stand out." I looked past my own reflection at the dark yard and Ray's maple standing there with no leaves on it yet. I said, "I think I've got something." I did not tell her what. I hung up and I stood in that kitchen for a while with my hand still on the phone, and I understood something I had been carefully not understanding for a long time. Curtis was not going to be corrected by me. Not that night, not at that ceremony, not ever. But there are other people in the world who correct things. And one of them, at that exact moment, was 2 miles away sitting in a diner off Columbia Pike with a cup of coffee, going cold, filling out a request form he had absolutely no business filling out and not telling me a thing about it. Hollis Bream and I have been having breakfast at the same diner 4 times a year since 2011. He was my operations sergeant. Sergeant Major, retired, 62 years old, built like a filing cabinet with a grey moustache. He trims with more discipline than most people bring to their finances. He drinks his coffee black and he salts everything before he tastes it, which is the only unreasonable thing about him. We do not talk about the old days at those breakfasts. That was never the arrangement.
We talk about his son in Tacoma, and my knees, and whether the Nationals have any pitching, and once, memorably, for 40 minutes, about gutter guards. But that morning in March he was strange. He kept turning his cup a quarter turn at a time, the way he used to do at a table with a map on it, when he had something to say and was deciding on the order of the words. I said, "Say it, Bream." He said, "You going to this thing next month?" "Curtis says the whole family's going." "That's not what I asked, Mum." He still calls me Ma'am. 9 years of diner breakfasts, and I have never gotten him to stop, and at some point I quit trying because I understood it wasn't about me. It was about him, and about a particular week in 1994, and about a thing he does not talk about either. I said, "I'll go. Rosie wants to see the flags." He turned the cup another quarter turn. He said, "You ever tell your family what we did?" And there it was. 9 years of gutter guards, and he'd finally walked up to the fence and put his hand on it. I said, "It was a long time ago." He looked at me for what felt like a while. Outside, a bus went by and the window rattled in its frame the way it always does, and the waitress topped off his cup without asking because she has been topping off his cup without asking for a decade. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "Your husband knew. He knew, and he sat there." I put my fork down. I said Ray didn't know the details. "He didn't need the details," Hollis said. "He knew you came home in November of 94, 11 pounds down and sleeping with the hall light on. A man doesn't need details for that." I want to be fair to Ray even now. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided that keeping his brother comfortable was a small price, and he never once did the arithmetic on who was actually paying it. I said, "Curtis is Curtis. It doesn't cost anything." And Hollis Bream, who in 22 years of service never once raised his voice at me, said very quietly, "It costs the kid." I did not have an answer for that. He knew I didn't. He let it sit there between the syrup and the napkin holder. And he ate the rest of his eggs, and then he paid, which he always does, and which I have never won an argument about. At the door, with his hand on the glass, he said, "Mom, in about 2 weeks, don't be angry with me." I said, "What did you do, Bream?" He said, "Something I should have done in 95. And he went out to his truck and drove off. And I stood in the parking lot of a diner off Columbia Pike with my keys in my hand for longer than a sensible woman would. The next 3 weeks, the family organized itself. That is what my in-laws do instead of celebrating. They organize. There were group messages. There was a spreadsheet which Marlene made, with a tab for hotel rooms nobody needed because everyone lives within 30 minutes of that building. And there was the matter of seats. Curtis called me on a Thursday. He had been on the phone with somebody's assistant, he said, and there were limited seats up front, and he wanted to walk me through the plan. The plan was this. Curtis and Marlene would sit forward with their son Brandon, because Brandon works in government affairs, and in Curtis's words, there'll be people in that room he needs to be in front of. Daniel would sit with them if his route let him get back in time, and I would sit toward the rear with Rosie, because, and he said this in the voice of a man solving a problem generously, the little one might get squirmy, and you'll want to be near the doors. I said that was fine. It was fine. I have sat in the back of rooms for most of my adult life. Movement people sit near the doors. That is not a punishment, that is the job. But then he kept going because Curtis always keeps going, and he arrived at the part he'd actually called to say. He said, "And honestly, Viv, if she melts down, you could just take her out to the car. Nobody would think anything of it. You'd be doing everybody a favor." Silence. You'd be doing everybody a favor? I stood in my kitchen and looked at the east window, and the light was that thin, early spring gold that only lasts about 9 minutes. And I said, "I'll see how she does." Here is where it stopped being about me. For 34 years, the warehouse story had cost me exactly nothing that I couldn't afford. A little dignity at a cookout, a paper plate and a smile. I had made my peace with it in the way you make peace with a knee that aches before rain.
But that Thursday it had reached out and touched a 7-year-old.
Because Rosie was going to be in that room. And Rosie was going to hear her great uncle explain in front of 100 strangers who mattered and who was near the doors. And children do not hear the words. Children hear the arrangement. Rosie was going to walk out of the Pentagon with a picture in her head of where her grandmother belonged, and she was going to keep that picture for the next 50 years, the way I have kept the picture of my own grandmother, standing at the sink while the men ate. That night, I was tucking her in under the glow stars, and she was quiet for a bit, and then she said, "Grandma, what did you used to do before me?" I opened my mouth, and the sentence came up out of me automatically the way it always had. It was a long time ago, but I did not say it. I sat there on the edge of her bed with my hand on her back, and I could not make the words come out, and I understood finally at 60 years old that the sentence had never been humility. It was a door I had been holding shut with my shoulder. I said I moved things, big things, sometimes, to hard places. She thought about it. She thinks about everything. She said, like a truck driver. I said, like the person who tells the trucks where to go. She said okay and rolled over satisfied and was asleep in 90 seconds the way only a 7-year-old can be. 2 days later, the envelope came. It was a Saturday and the mail was the usual Saturday brick, a grocery flyer, a roofing company, 2 things for a woman who has not lived at my address since the Clinton years, and underneath all of it, a plain government envelope with a window in the front and my name showing through the window. I almost put the whole stack in the bin on the porch. That bin exists precisely so junk mail never crosses my threshold. My thumb was on the lid. Then I saw my name through that little window, and it was not the name I use at the pharmacy. Strand Vivian A., Colonel, United States Army, retired. I stood on my own porch in my gardening pants, and I looked at that for a while. Inside were 2 things. The first was a summary of my service. Dates, assignments, units, schools, the whole spine of a life, laid out in the flat, unbothered language of a government form. Fort Eustis, Fort Bragg, Germany twice, Korea once. 24 lines about a woman I used to be, typed by somebody who never met her. The second was a folder, and inside the folder were orders. Award orders. Copies of the original documents with the original dates on them and clipped to the front of the stack on paper that had gone the colour of weak tea. A citation dated the 4th of November, 1994. I had not looked at that citation since I was 29 years old. I sat down on the porch step. I did not mean to. My legs just made the decision without consulting me. I am not going to walk you through every line of it. Some of that is mine, and some of it belongs to people who did not come home, and I am not going to spend either one on a story. But I will tell you the shape of it. In the fall of 1994, I was a captain in charge of a movement control element, and for 11 days we ran a port and a dirt airfield that were not built for what we had to put through them. The people in the planning slides were cargo. In real life, they were families and stretchers and a hospital's worth of equipment that had to be in one place by a certain hour, or it was going to be worth nothing at all. There were nights it got loud. There was one night in particular when it got very loud, and the decision about whether to keep the offload running belonged to exactly one person on that airfield, and that person was 29 years old and had a clipboard in her hand. I kept it running. That is the whole heroic content of my career, if you want to call it that. A woman with a clipboard decided not to stop. 11 days later, a colonel I'd met twice shook my hand and said, "You'll get something for this." And I said, "Thank you." And then I got on a plane, and then I got another assignment, and the years did what years do. The medal came in the mail in 1995, in a box to an apartment in Newport News, and Ray was at work, and I put the box on a shelf in the hall closet and made spaghetti. That is not humility either. I want to be honest about that too. Part of me put that box on the shelf because I had come home in November 11 pounds down and sleeping with the hall light on,
And looking at that box meant looking at that airfield, and I was not ready. And then some number of years went by, and I told myself I had missed the window on ever bringing it up, and the not bringing it up became its own habits, and habits become people. Clipped to the back of the folder was a routing slip. A request had been submitted for a personnel summary and copies of award orders for inclusion in a ceremony packet. The requesting party was a retired sergeant major with a name I know as well as my own. I sat on that step until the concrete went cold through my pants, and then I laughed once out loud in an empty yard. Don't be angry with me. In about 2 weeks, I was not angry. I have not been angry with Hollis Bream about anything since a Tuesday in 1993, when he threw out my coffee because I had not slept in 30 hours. I called his cell. He did not pick up, which was cowardly, and also very smart. I put everything back in the envelope. And then I did something that I have turned over many times since, and I still could not tell you exactly why I did it. I did not put it in my purse. I walked into Rosie's room and I unzipped the front pocket of her backpack. The small one, the one with the marker stain, and I slid that folder down flat against the bottom, and I zipped it back up. Maybe I wanted it in the room without wanting it in my hand. Maybe some part of me already knew who it was actually for. Then I went to the hall closet and I moved the winter coats, and for the first time in 4 years, I pulled down the zipper on the garment bag. The uniform was still in there, pressed with the ribbons above the pocket and a smell of cedar and dry cleaning fluid that took the top of my head off. I took it into the bedroom and I put it on, alone, with the door shut at 60 years old, on a Saturday afternoon, in a house where nobody was watching. It fit. A little snug through the shoulders, close enough. I stood in front of the mirror on the back of the closet door, and I looked at a woman I had not been introduced to in a long time. And I will tell you honestly that my eyes went hot, and I let them. Then I took it off, and I hung it back up, and I zipped the bag. Because here is the thing about wearing it to that ceremony. If I had walked into that building in that uniform, I would have been making an argument. And the second you make an argument in my family, Curtis gets to have an opinion about it, and Marlene gets to say something warm and terrible about how nice it is that I still have it, and the whole thing turns into a conversation about me being dramatic. 34 years of practice had taught me exactly one thing about that family. You cannot win the argument. So I wore a navy dress. The plain one. The one Marlene would have picked out for me on that Saturday shopping trip if I had let her. The morning of the ceremony was one of those Virginia spring days that shows off. 68 degrees dogwoods going, that heavy green smell coming off everything. I packed Rosie a snack at the counter in my kitchen, because a 7-year-old at a government function without crackers is a tactical error. Apple slices, a cheese stick, the crackers with the little fish shapes. She stood at the door in her good dress with her backpack on both shoulders, and she asked me if it was going to be boring. I said, probably, but there'll be flags. She said, how many? I said, sweetheart, more than you can count. She took that as a challenge, which is exactly how I meant it. You do not simply walk into that building. There is a process, and the process has its own weather. Badges, a line, a young specialist checking names against a printed list on a clipboard, which made me smile for reasons nobody in that lobby would have understood. Curtis was already inside, holding court by a display case, wearing a beautiful grey suit and the expression of a man who believes he has arranged the sunrise. He saw us and came over with his arms wide. There she is. And there's the little one. He crouched down to Rosie's level, which is the one thing about Curtis that has always been genuinely good. He likes children, and children like him. You ready to see the biggest office building in the world, sweetheart? Rosie said. How many flags are in it? Curtis laughed and stood back up and said to me over her head, where does she get that? I said, no idea. The first time was by the escalator. A woman in a dark suit with a badge on a blue lanyard stopped to say hello to Curtis, and Curtis introduced Brandon and then Marlene, and then he put his hand on my shoulder and said, and this is Vivian, she's the nanny. She watches the little one for us." The woman smiled at me, not unkindly, the way you smile at someone who is going to be somewhere else in a minute. I said, "Nice to meet you. Here is what I want you to understand, because I have thought about it more than I have thought about the ceremony itself." In that moment, I felt no anger at all. I felt something much stranger. I felt the smoothness of it. 34 years of repetition had worn that sentence down into a river stone. It went out of him without any effort at all, because it had been going out of him since Reagan, and it fit the shape of his mouth. He was not lying to that woman. That is the part that took me the longest to accept. He believed it. Curtis had told that story so many times that it had become for him a memory. The second time was in the corridor with the flags. There is a stretch of hallway in that building where the state flags hang in a long line, and Rosie stopped dead at the head of it, like she had walked into a cathedral. She let go of my hand and started down the row with her lips moving. A man about my age, in a blue blazer, said something pleasant to Curtis about the little girl, and Curtis said, "That's my great niece, and that's her nanny keeping an eye on things." Her nanny. Not my sister-in-law, who happens to watch her. Not Ray's wife. The nanny promoted to a job title, a thing I would have on a tax form. And this time it was not smooth. This time Marlene glanced at me. That glance is going to stay with me. Because it was not cruel, and it was not apologetic. It was checking. Marlene looked at me the way you look at a pot on a burner to see whether it was going to do anything. I did not do anything. I said, "She's counting them." And the man laughed and we all moved on. The third time was at the reception table. It was 10 minutes before the ceremony in a room with coffee and small pastries that nobody was eating because nobody knew whether they were allowed to. Curtis had found a colonel. An actual serving colonel, young for it, maybe 45, standing by himself with a cup, and Curtis went after him the way he goes after a man with a leasing decision to make. Rosie had her backpack on both shoulders and her hand in mine. Curtis got about 90 seconds into the property on Eade Street before he remembered his manners, and he turned and said, "Oh, sorry, my wife Marlene, my son Brandon, and that's Vivian, she's with the little one. Family nanny, basically, keeps the whole operation running." Keeps the whole operation running. You could not have written it better. And the colonel, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, did not look at Curtis. He looked at me. He looked at my face, and then his eyes went down about 6 inches to my hands, and then something in his own face changed very slightly and did not change back. He said, "Mom, have we met?" I said, "I don't believe so." He kept looking. He said, "Were you at Eustace?" And Curtis, who cannot survive a silence, jumped in and said, "Oh, she was army way back. Warehouse. Ray, my brother, God rest him. Ray was the real soldier in that family." The colonel did not answer him. He said to me, still not looking at Curtis, "Ma'am, I'd like to shake your hand." And I let him, and he did not say anything else, and I said the only thing I ever said that whole night about any of it. I said it was a long time ago. Then a young captain with a folder came through the room saying it was time, and everybody started moving toward the doors, and I got about 4 steps before a hand touched my elbow. It was the captain with the folder. She was maybe 28. She had my last name written on a card in her hand, and she said, very quietly, so that nobody else could hear it, "Mom, could you come with me? You're supposed to be up front." I said, "There's some mistake. I'm sitting in back with my granddaughter." She turned the card around. It said, Strand 5, Row 1, Seat 4. And under that, in smaller type, the words that stopped my heart for a beat and a half. Guest of honor party. I said, "The little one comes with me." The captain said, "Yes, ma'am, that's already on here." I heard Curtis behind me say, Viv, where are you going? We're this way." And I did the thing I am not proud of and would do again. I did not turn around.
I took Rosie's hand and I walked up the middle of that room behind a captain with a clipboard, past my brother-in-law, past Marlene with her mouth slightly open, and I did not look at either one of them, because if I had looked, I would have started explaining, and I had nothing to explain with. I did not know myself what was happening. They sat us in the front row. Rosie's feet did not touch the floor. The room filled. 300 people, give or take. Old men, mostly in blazers with unit pins, some of them with canes, some of them with wives holding their arms. A few in uniform. A row of chairs on the stage and a podium with the seal on it and the flag standing up behind. 6 seats down from me, at the end of the front row, a man in a grey suit with a grey moustache sat, with his hands on his knees, staring straight ahead at the wall, like a man at his own court-martial. Hollis Bream would not look at me. He looked at that wall for 11 straight minutes. The general officer who came to the podium was about my age, maybe, and then he said he wanted to talk about the movement element. He said that the corridor stayed open because a small group of soldiers and sailors kept it open, and that most people in this country have never heard of any of them, and that this was, in his opinion, an accounting error that history keeps making. Then he said he wanted to say a name. And he said mine. He said, Colonel Vivian Strand, United States Army, retired. Somewhere behind me and to the left I heard a chair move. I stood up. My knees did it without asking me. 28 years builds that in, and it does not come out. He said, Mom, would you come forward? And Rosie, 7 years old, in her good dress, slid down off her chair and came with me because nobody had told her not to, and because she has never in her life let go of my hand when she thought I might need it. And not one soul in that room stopped her. He had a folder on the podium. He opened it. He said, in the fall of 1994, then Captain Strand commanded the movement control element at an airfield and seaport that were, by any honest assessment, not capable of what was asked of them. Then he began to say the citation out loud. I am not going to give you all of it. I have already told you why. But I will tell you that it used the phrase, under conditions of considerable personal risk, and that it named the number of people moved out of that place, and that the number was 4,160, and that I had never once in 31 years said that number to another human being, including my husband. The room was absolutely silent. He said the date the orders were signed. He said the name of the officer who signed them. He said the word valor, which is a word I have never applied to myself and never will. And then he said, these orders were mailed to Captain Strand's quarters in 1995. They were never handed to her in front of anybody. He shut the folder. He said, that's a thing we can fix in about 90 seconds. I do not remember him coming down off the stage. I remember his shoes on the floor. I remember that my hands were steady, which surprised me, and that Rosie had somehow gotten her backpack off one shoulder and was holding it against her chest with both arms, and that she was staring up at him with her whole face. And then this 7-year-old, in a silent room with 300 people in it, unzipped the front pocket of that backpack, took out a plain government envelope, and held it up to a general officer of the United States Army. Because she had watched her grandmother put it in there, and she had decided in her own methodical way that this was clearly the moment it was for. He crouched down. He took it from her with 2 hands, the way you take something from a child when you want the child to know it counts. He looked inside. He looked at me. He said to her, do you know who your grandmother is? And Rosie said, she tells the trucks where to go. I have been told the laugh in that room went on for a while. I could not tell you. I was busy. Then he stood up, and he said the rest of it, and he did the part with the medal. And the room stood. 300 people, canes and all. And somewhere in the middle of all that standing, I looked back once. Curtis was already gone. The reception afterward took an hour and a half, and I could not tell you 6 words of it. People came up. Old men came up. One of them held onto my hand and said a first name I had not heard out loud since 1994, a young sergeant's name.
and neither one of us said anything else, and he went and sat down. Hollis Bream stood by the wall the entire time, with his hands behind his back, and would not come near me. I finally cornered him by the coffee. I said, "Sergeant Major." He said, "Ma'am." I said, "You had no authority to do that." And Hollis Bream, 62 years old, said, "No, ma'am, I did not." And his chin went just once, and he got it back under control, and he said, "But somebody was going to have to say it out loud before we're all dead, and it wasn't ever going to be you." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't." So I didn't. We stood there and drank bad government coffee and did not talk about 1994, which is the arrangement and which I intend to keep for as long as he is alive. Marlene found me by the doors on the way out. She had been crying and had fixed it mostly. She said, "Vivian, I want you to know that I never once—" And I said, "Marlene, it's fine." Because it was not fine. And because there are moments when the kindest available thing is to let someone put the lid back on. I am not a saint. I just did not have another conversation in me that day. We found Curtis in the parking garage. He was standing at the back of his car with the trunk open and nothing in his hands, and he had been standing there long enough that a man 2 rows over was watching him. He saw us, and he shut the trunk, and he opened his mouth, and what came out was not a sentence. It was 3 false starts, and then this. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Viv, I didn't. 30 years I've been standing there telling people." And he stopped, because he had arrived at the actual size of it, and the actual size of it was not a mistake, it was a habit. And a habit that long is a person. He said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" And there it was. The question that puts it back on me. And I want to be honest with you because a story is only worth anything if the person telling it takes their share. I could have said, "Because you never asked." I could have said, "Because you talked over me for 34 years. Both of those are true, and both of those are the ledger I had been keeping, and the ledger is the part that was mine. So what I said was, because I liked being right about you more than I wanted you to know." Curtis Vale stood in a parking garage under the Pentagon and cried in front of his wife, his son, his sister-in-law, and a 7-year-old. Then he said the only genuinely graceful thing I have ever heard him say. He said, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me today. I'd just like to drive you home." So I gave him my keys. And he drove us home badly because Curtis has always driven like a man arguing with the road, and Rosie fell asleep in the back somewhere around the 14th Street Bridge with the folder still on her lap. It has been a little over a year. Curtis is not a different man. People don't turn into different men at 66. But he is a quieter one. He asks a question now and then, waits for the whole answer, and you can see it costing him. And I have decided that watching a man pay for something in small change every Sunday is worth more than any apology. He asked me in the fall if I would come talk to his Rotary Club. I said no. He said, "Figured, had to ask." That is where we are, and it is further than I expected to get. Daniel got a route closer to home. Rosie is 8 now, and she still counts things, and last month she asked me what a citation is, and I told her, and she thought about it for a long time, and then asked whether the sergeant who did not come home has a granddaughter. I said I didn't know. She said we should find out. We are working on that. Last Sunday she wanted a picture. Her idea, not mine. So I got the garment bag down out of the hall closet, and I put on the green uniform in my own living room, with the afternoon light coming through, and she got Ray's flag out of its case shelf and held one corner of it with both hands, very carefully, the way you hold something you have been told the weight of. Neither one of us was crying. We were just standing there in a plain room in Arlington being exactly who we are. I spent 34 years believing that letting people be wrong about me was a form of strength. That the truth would keep the way canned goods keep. That being quiet and being humble were the same thing. They are not the same thing. Humility is knowing what you are worth and not needing to announce it. What I was doing was something else.
I was letting a story stand that had a child in it, and the child was going to inherit it, and I was calling that grace. You do not owe anybody a speech about your life. But if there is a person coming up behind you who is going to learn who they are partly from who they think you are, then the truth is not yours to sit on. It belongs to them too. Say it plainly once and then let it go. Not to win, not to settle a score, just so that the accounting is right and the people who love you are loving the actual person. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who has spent a long time letting the wrong version stand. And if you would like to sit with me for another one, I would be honored to have you back.